Welcome to the Focus and Chill podcast, where we discuss productivity tactics that work for neurodivergent individuals.
Every episode, we interview guests with lived experience of neurodiversity who also have a solid productivity and habit game, and pass the learnings on to you, our wise and benevolent audience.
We're your hosts, Jeremy and Joey.
I'm Joey, and I coach creatives to get moving on their most ambitious projects through the power of solid habits and strong focus. I'm also a perpetual student of psychology and perpetually on a quest to a one-armed chin-up.
And I'm Jeremy, a neurospicy software developer turned startup founder, building the Focus Bear app to help people with ADHD and autism thrive at work. My cool party trick is leaving parties early so I can get to sleep in time for my 2-hour-long morning routine. The Focus and Chill podcast is brought to you by Focus Bear, a focus enhancement app for ADHDers. That's adults with both combined autism and ADHD. I'm Jeremy, I'm an ADHDer myself. I'm the founder of Focus Bear and also one of the hosts of this podcast. I built Focus Bear for myself originally because I was constantly getting distracted by my phone and my laptop. I wanted a way to tame my ADHD monkey mind so I'd stop going down rabbit holes and actually get work done, but also get off my computer and my phone in the evening so I'd be able to sleep properly. It's working perfectly for me and it's helping a lot of ADHDs as well. I'd love for you to try it. It's available for Mac, Windows, iOS and Android, and it leverages most of the productivity strategies we talk about on the podcast. You can jump onto focusbear.io or just Google Focus Bear and try it out. Let me know what you think. Welcome to episode number 83 of the Focus and Chill podcast. We're thrilled to be joined by Rosie Putland today. Rosie is a proudly disabled and autistic public speaker, creative consultant, and co-founder of Modality Co, a digital accessibility consultancy focusing on creating connection through accessibility. She is passionate and experienced in working with teams and leaders to develop sustainable, holistic digital accessibility practices. Rosie is known for her ability to create engaging presentations that change perspectives, her unwavering commitment to the accessibility and disability community, and her special interest in ducks. Welcome to the show, Rosie.
Thanks so much, Jeremy.
I'm just noticing the ducks part at the end. I'm keen to ask about that. But let's start when you first realized that you weren't neurotypical and the journey that you've had since then.
Yeah, sorry, now I'm distracted by ducks and thinking about ducks. But I've always had some awareness. I think a lot of people have had some awareness of being like different growing up as a child, that general awareness that maybe I'm not like everyone else. And then you get in your head about it and think about it like, oh, do I just think I'm special? But really, I assign that feeling of being different to a lot of other reasons. I was experiencing poverty as a young child. I was experiencing family violence. I was also developing my identity around being queer. All of those sorts of things contribute to that feeling of, am I different? And I am different than other people as well, especially growing up in regional and rural communities as well, where there's not as much acceptance of those things. It's seen as taboo, all of those sorts of things as well. So I've always felt that something was off, but I assigned it to other reasons as well. I think there was some pretty clear signs in childhood too, that nicknames like the Human Dictionary or teachers having conversations when you weren't like present and just saying, oh, that's just how Rosie is, blah, blah, blah. Those sorts of signs probably could have been a little bit more clear indicators to me that there was something else going on, but it wasn't taken as seriously back then. And I really felt everyone but me knew I was autistic. And when I told people I've been diagnosed as autistic or formally recognized as autistic, everyone was like, yeah, that makes sense. Like no one else was shocked. When I was a young person as well, I remember finding other neurodivergents and saying, oh, we have the same brain, and not really having those words of neurodivergent to be able to assign to that. I was just thinking, well, we're so similar. We have the same brain. And I remember literally using the word same brain syndrome in referring to it. And I just didn't have that language to say neurodivergent or autistic as well. So I think I realized I was autistic when I was 16 was when I had that language to say, I think I'm autistic. And it was from this big, long, shared Word document, I think, of traits of female autistics. I'm sure people have mentioned this document before. It's this shared Word document. And I remember going through and highlighting every single one that related to me. And then because I was like so worried about like assigning something else to myself, I like screenshot everything with my highlights and sent it to my friend and said, does this seem right to you? Like I was conscious of not assigning something to myself that wasn't true. Or I was really worried about that feeling of self-diagnosis, which now I recognize that self-identifying or self-diagnosis, whatever the language we want to use for it, is so valid and accepted within community as well. So I realized when I was about 16, and it wasn't until I was an adult and I was 20 and I was formally identified. And that came from going through really extreme autistic burnout. And that was like, that's what resulted in that diagnosis at that time.
Mm. Do you remember some of the traits that you highlighted in that doc?
I know. I'd have to go back and look at it. I think a couple of years ago, I found the screenshots of those and I was like, oh, this is so weird to look back on. Obviously, one of them was around intense interests and it gave like different examples than like what we typically see. And I think the examples were like more to do with like boy bands and music, or I think like one of the examples was like books and like book series. And that was really applicable to me when I was a young person as well, as just going so deeply into books. And there's a particular book series which I don't align with now, but at the time I think I'd wrote it about 25 times, this like 7-book series. And I remember making jokes like online that, oh, like my parents want to take me to a psychologist because I've read this book series so many times. And looking back on that, I was like, yeah, they probably should have, because I was autistic and I needed support. But yeah, I remember thinking that was like really funny at the time, that I was such a dedicated fan that my parents would think about taking me to a psychologist. It's such a weird thing to reflect on now.
Yeah, and I imagine in terms of being the human dictionary, some of that would come from being a really voracious reader, and there'd be
Yeah,
a lot of positives to that. But imagine
yeah.
some challenges from just the way that other young people perceived you. What type of challenges did you experience as you were growing up?
Yeah, and even reflecting back on the human dictionary part of it, I lived in a really small town and we had a very small school library, and I was determined to read every single book in this very small school library. Like it was like a school of 40 kids. So it was a really small library, but I did read all of the books in that library. So that's
Nice.
probably what got me that nickname as well. But yeah, challenges I faced, I think like a lot of us, school was a massive challenge. When you're different, there is a lot of bullying and there is a lot of things that go on. And I think even more so for me, I attended 11 different schools over both my primary and high school experience. So that was changing schools 1 or 2 times a year sometimes, and that made it really difficult. I struggle now with change. Like I can't even really visualize how difficult that must have been for me during that time. And so yeah, therefore when you're changing so much, it's much more difficult to make that meaningful connection with people as well. And it's particularly growing up regionally and remotely, and there's like less representation of people who are queer, there's less representation of people who are neurodivergent or people who are disabled as well. Or if there is those people in your community, they're generally hidden away or it's talked about in a certain way as well. So I think for me, like leaving home for university really changed my world. And I remember so many people saying to me like, oh, you're just going to find your people when you get to university. And even though I wasn't diagnosed then, like looking back on that, I think what they were saying was that I was going to find my neurodivergent community and my disabled community as well. And when I did go to university, I really actually experienced severe autistic burnout. I lost all of my sort of systems and I had to completely rebuild from there. And it was really difficult going through that. And eventually diagnosis or formal identification is what actually helped me be able to put strategies in place to be able to thrive in a new environment as well.
Could you talk a bit about the experience of autistic burnout in that context? I guess you'd already been through changing schools a lot, but I guess going to university, completely new system and new location, all of that. What was it like going through that experience?
Yeah, it was just, I think for me, a real apathy towards anything. And I think even now, just regular burnout for me starts as apathy towards everything or towards certain things. I know when I'm starting to get into that a little bit of burnout, and usually when I can pull it back and be like, oh no, okay, I'm going into burnout. What can I do to stop this? Is that feeling of apathy towards things that I typically love. And I think that's really what happened to me when I was going into that really severe autistic burnout, is that I just had apathy for everything, and including things that were special interests to me, including things that I really cared about and had worked so hard for, particularly like getting into university. And I really cared about what I was studying. And when I started feeling apathy for that, that was the start of it. And it just went deeper and deeper and resulted in really severe insomnia as well, which was really difficult to deal with. The less you sleep, the worse just everything in your world gets when you're not sleeping for multiple nights in a row. Inability to be able to actually look after yourself really starts to result in those dire outcomes as well, especially when you're trying to look after yourself for the first time, or you're trying to navigate systems like Centrelink and youth allowance and those sorts of things, as well as not sleeping, not looking after yourself because you like physically can't. I think those were some of the things that really characterized it. And it was really difficult to get out of that period. And it probably took me about 6 to 8 months to just get out of that really dire situation, and it's being able to start rebuilding from that. And it was quite heavy external factors that led to me actually being able to get out of that space as well.
Yeah, that sounds so hard. Sorry that you went through that. And you mentioned that as part of going through this really difficult period, you did get the formal identification. What happened after that in terms of changes that you experienced post-diagnosis?
Yeah, so I remember feeling really relieved. I think by the time that I got to actually going through that formal identification process, I just wanted my feelings validated. And I think for a lot of neurodivergent people, when you've spent your whole life not being validated for the things that you're struggling with or the experiences that you're having, there is that really deep need for validation from someone who has a higher power than you. And so there was a lot of relief when I went through that. And then I think it became a really big shakeup of how I perceived my whole life. And I often talk to people who have been recently diagnosed or people seeking diagnosis. And I often say it's like recontextualizing your entire life with this new knowledge. I said that's inherently traumatic, like having to go back and look at your life and being like, oh, that's why that happened. And even talking about it now, like certain things, I'm like, oh, I didn't even realize that was related to my experience as a neurodivergent person or my experience as an autistic person. I'm like, oh, that's probably why that happened. And then there became, things of accommodating myself, which is, to me, it's so joyful and so hard at the same time, but really joyful, and being able to see myself thrive in situations as well. And that real part of self-discovery, not only just looking back on the past, but being able to discover who I am now and what do I want to be able to do and what makes me thrive and be joyful and be able to lean into that more. And I think pre-diagnosis, sometimes it feels wrong to lean into those things that bring you joy. There's something wrong about it, or you shouldn't be that interested in that thing. And there's a lot of shame that you're made to feel about having those things that bring you joy. And I think being able to switch that post-diagnosis, and even though it's still hard now, absolutely, being able to switch that was a big change in my life, and being able to lean into that and lean into my neurodivergence and my identity as being autistic rather than feel that intense shame around it. And that's not to say I don't still feel shame and I don't still feel internalized ableism. Absolutely, I do. I'm fighting it every single day. But that experience of being able to lean in is probably the part that I enjoy most post-diagnosis.
Yeah, I can really relate to that, the traumatic aspect of just thinking about all of the memories that I guess I had potentially suppressed for some time of some of the challenges during high school, but also the joy of being able to accept that actually I'm allowed to enjoy these things that other people consider weird, but they're actually really meaningful and fun for me. I can see that almost ambivalent approach of feeling post, having the identification.
Mm.
What's it like now in terms of challenges that you still face now?
Yeah, I think I maybe think differently about the challenges I face now. And I think they're like beyond just like purely my neurodivergence or purely being autistic. I think about it as like, how does my neurodivergence impact every aspect of my life? And I'll give a content note here before I talk about this, but a content note for cancer. So for this year, for example, I've been through cancer treatment and trying to find any sort of information or support for what it's like to be autistic and have cancer is just like virtually impossible. Like I'm scouring Reddit because there's just no other information out there and my doctors can't tell me what it's going to be like. And I'm really lucky to have just a really great psychologist who is neurodivergent and disabled herself, who has been able to help me with a lot of that research and set a lot of those expectations of what treatment's going to be like and things like that as well. So yeah, when I think about challenges now, it's like, how does my neurodivergence intersect, particularly with my other health conditions as well? I also have rheumatoid arthritis. And so trying to Google like, what is it like for someone who is autistic, who has rheumatoid arthritis, and is going through this particular cancer treatment that I'm going through? There's just no information for that online. And so, yeah, that's what I really think about with my challenges now. It's just like, how does my neurodivergent identity intersect with other challenges that I might be having as well? Yeah.
Grateful for you talking about that as well, because
Mm.
hopefully through some of the other public speaking you do in this episode, people will be able to find it and it will help other people in the future going through it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the other thing I'm asked a lot about in terms of challenges now, it's something I don't necessarily find personally challenging a lot, but I know a lot of other people do, and I'm asked a lot about it, is a lot about disclosure of neurodivergence or sharing that you're neurodivergent. I know some people don't like the word disclosing as well. That can be challenging for them too. I think it's really interesting. And I think about the discrimination we face, whether we disclose or whether we don't disclose. If I don't disclose, I'm called all these words like weird, strange, awkward, and that's some of them are not as nice as those terms. And if I do disclose, then I'm often infantilized. So it's like a toss up of what sort of discrimination do I feel like experiencing today? If I don't disclose, people are going to know something's up. And I think that's really relates to my experience as a child as well. As people knew I was autistic. People were discriminating against me because I was autistic without me being diagnosed as autistic. That diagnosis didn't change whether I was discriminated against or not. And I reflect on a lot of those experiences. And for me, I like to say, as I've grown in my disabled identity and understood a lot of my chronic health conditions, and like I use a cane, for example, now to walk, but I was bullied when I was a young person, like as in primary school and high school, for walking funny. And that was always brought up. And at the time, I did not have any acceptance of the pain that I was having or the difficulties I was having with walking and with pain and things like that now. But I was still being discriminated against for those things. And I think that discrimination, unfortunately, is a fact of life. And then that disclosure with it, I choose to disclose because I feel like I have power over that situation. And at least with the autistic part, people are like, oh, that makes sense. Like it's like an explanation for them of whatever they might have already been thinking about me. And at least they can assign it to my own language rather than the language that they might be using in their head. And I would prefer to be in control of that narrative. And that's, for me, why disclosure is important.
Rosie, could you say more about some of the new exceptional strengths that you're leaning into now at the moment, especially with your work at Modality Co?
Yeah, this is probably the question that I struggled with most preparing for this, but I really narrowed it down to three that I think, and I actually asked my husband and some peers, I'm like, what do you think? What do you see as the things that I do that maybe yourself can't do, or I just do in a different way as well? So the first one, I like to call it intuition, but it's probably, if we're going to talk about it in a clinical way, it might be pattern recognition. But I like intuition. I think that's a nicer word, or it's gut instinct. And I think for that judgment of character or judgment of situation is a strength that I really have. I'm often the first one to question something and to be like, I'm not sure about this. I feel like this might not go well, or I feel like this might end badly, those sorts of feelings. And for me, that's through that pattern recognition of being able to see when something's a little bit sus or a little bit off as well. And I see that as a really big strength because it can often help us not get into bad situations or make a deal with someone or go down a path with a client that is potentially not helpful for us in our work as well. The second one I had was a sense of justice. And I think it's a little bit of a controversial one. Like when we talk about autistic traits, a strong sense of justice, what does that actually mean? I think for me, it helps to drive me as an advocate because I just always have that sort of part of me churning inside. It never goes away. I can't really let go of things, which has its negatives, but it also has its positives as well. And I think it makes me a really strong advocate and someone who's always driving for change, particularly in disability spaces and accessibility spaces, which is where I work. And then the third one is that ability to learn new things quickly. Like I have a little bit of I guess the audacity to try anything, and I can usually pick it up pretty quickly. And I just have no doubt in myself that I could probably learn this. Like, kind of think about myself, I'm like, there's probably not any job I couldn't do. Like, I could learn it if given enough time. Even things like people like, could you be a surgeon? But I'm like, probably. I just feel like I could. And that sometimes has its cons as well. There's so many things I want to try because I feel like I do try. I could be good at it. But yeah, I think it's really good. And especially as an entrepreneur, when you do have to try lots of new things and you have to learn so many different things, having that tenacity and wanting to learn and that ability to learn things quickly is really helpful as an entrepreneur. And I think that's why we see so many neurodivergent entrepreneurs as well.
And could you talk a little bit more about the work you're doing at Modality Co? And I also hear that you run some meetups for the Tasmanian digital accessibility community. So can you go into more details on that as well?
Yeah, so the way I like to explain my business, not a lot of people have heard of digital accessibility. What's that? So the way I like to explain it is just like buildings have access requirements. So they might have requirements like lifts or ramps or accessible toilets, those sorts of things that we typically see in buildings. Websites and digital products have accessibility requirements too. So there's a standard called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is an international standard that organizations and businesses and governments need to be meeting. The legality of that looks different depending on what jurisdiction you're in. For example, in America, there's Section 508. The risk of being sued for having an inaccessible website is really high, whereas in Australia, the risk of being sued, although that risk is still there, it's not as common, and that's due to the softer nature of the law in Australia. I'm hoping that will still change, but there is a requirement for government to meet those international standards for accessibility of websites and digital products as well. And it's also just seen as the right thing to do, and particularly for big businesses who have been sued before. For example, Coles has been sued, the Sydney Olympics has been sued, and there's a couple of other examples as well. So basically what I do is I work with businesses on the accessibility of their digital products and services from lots of different angles. But at the moment, we are booked up for the rest of the year. We're working with a couple of different big clients on the accessibility of their websites, assessing those and then helping them remediate those issues to ultimately lead to better outcomes for their disabled customers and also for everyone, as we often see that accessibility benefits all people as well. And then there's also running and writing training for organizations, which is particularly where I get my joy from, is being in the room or on the virtual room as well, and speaking to organizations as well. And then the other part of it is we also do a lot of community work. So the way our business is set up is as a social enterprise, and we're working towards certification for that as well. But we do a lot of community work as well. And one of the ways we do that is the Tasmanian Digital Accessibility Community. So it's a monthly meetup, and we hold it in the north and south of the state. And so we alternate, and we also have it online. And so really fostering the accessibility and disability community in Tas and building some of that maturity around particularly technology and accessibility in Tasmania as well. But yeah, I really enjoy that. It's definitely become one of my special interests is accessibility. You can probably tell that in the way that I speak about it.
Yeah, I'd love to ask you a lot more questions about that. We might have to do a follow-up podcast on that. Keen to hear, when you're not doing all those amazing projects, what do you do in your off time? And does it involve ducks at any point?
Yeah, it definitely involves ducks. We've just bought a house at the start of the year, and one of my big requirements was, can we be near a reserve that has some sort of birds in it? And we're really lucky where we live. There's a massive reserve just near our house. It's got a nice flat walkway, which is really helpful for me. And there are many ducks there. So although I don't have pet ducks yet, a lot of people ask me about that, particularly when I run training. I use a lot of duck examples in my training. And so everyone always asks me, like, when are you getting a pet duck? And I actually got a message on LinkedIn last night from a colleague who is in Copenhagen at the moment and saw this like amazing like rubber duck store, and he went in and just took photos of it, of everything for me and sent it to me. It's definitely something, people know I like ducks, so I get sent a lot of messages about ducks as well, which I just love. And I got this one email that's like probably my favorite email I've ever received. It was from a training participant, and we'd finished training a few weeks ago, and she had a question. And she sent me an email and she said, "Hi, Rosie, thanks so much again for the amazing training. Long live the duck." And then went on to ask a question. I was like, this is so beautiful. This is the best email I've ever gotten, and so nice. That's a whole other sidebar. It's not the dot points I had in the show notes for this, but I should have put ducks there as well. Other things that I enjoy outside of work. I love reading. I still love reading. Now took a break from it, but have really gone back to reading, and reading in ways that suits me and is accessible to me as well. I love the nonfiction space, particularly reading any disabled authors and their stories and their other books that give tips or just think about disability in lots of different ways. I'm really interested in that, and really interested in uplifting the voices of disabled storytellers as well. In terms of fiction, I love sci-fi. That's probably my go-to. Anything sci-fi. I do like fantasy a little bit, but not as much as sci-fi, and particularly hard sci-fi as well. I love my crafts, knitting and sewing when my hands allow me. As I have more difficulties with my rheumatoid arthritis, it's not always as easy, so I do have to take a lot of breaks now. And then gardening and interior design. I think especially buying a new house, there's a lot of excitement in that, and making things your own and things that are permanent as well, which is really cool.
And also, Rosie, I guess like with all the interest, let's just call it interest in ducks, it must be hard to stay focused during your working hours. How do you get the most out of your working hours?
Interest in ducks. Yeah, I just make all the things that I'm doing about ducks as well. That's why ducks have seeped into my training as well. But real talk, how do I stay productive during my working hours? I think probably one of the biggest things for me, like post-diagnosis, was realizing how much co-working works well for me. And I think in the ADHD community particularly, they love to call it body doubling, I think is the language that people use as well. I find that super, super helpful, whether it's just someone sitting in the room with me. In our previous house, we had 2 separate offices for my husband and I, he also works in the accessibility space as well. We had to, because we both ran training at the same time. So we needed to have doors between us so we could both be talking. In this house, and changes in work, we're able to have a joint office together, and then we have a separate meeting room when one of us needs to duck out for a meeting, and that works so much better. I love being able to have someone here just working and staying focused. It really helps keep me focused as well. When that isn't possible, one of the biggest hacks that I've found is finding someone who's doing a Twitch stream. There's a lot of people who do co-working Twitch streams, and they might do like a Pomodoro timer, and they might have like nice little music on, or they might have their checklist up like that they're working on as well. And I love that. I find that so helpful. That has gotten me through so much work, just being able to go find someone who's also working on a deadline and just having them sit there with me, even though I don't know anything about them. It's a little bit harder in Australia, I find, because of the time zone difference and things like that. But that's really helpful to me as well. And then the other part that I was thinking about is, what do I do if I'm feeling like particularly unmotivated? For me, often starting is the hardest part. Like, once I'm doing the work, I'm fine. I love the work. Getting started and doing that transition between not doing work and doing work is probably one of the most challenging things for me. So one of the ways that I guess I like trick my brain into working is to just set a timer for 5 minutes and say to myself, okay, I only have to do 5 minutes. And usually that tricks my brain into it because I get into a bit of a flow. I want to keep working on it. I don't want to leave something unfinished. I want to continue. And that starting is the hardest bit. And even if I can't continue, I've still done 5 minutes of work on it. And that's great. And that's still something better than nothing. So yeah, I often use that little hack to help myself get started.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that you're mentioning there, Rosie, is the idea of just get started, like just find a small step to get started, which is great advice to follow. Is there any particular productivity advice that you found that doesn't work for you?
Yeah, and I think that relates to what you're saying, Joey, finding that smallest step to get started. I think often we hear, I think the phrase is like, just eat the frog, which is do the hardest thing first and then everything else feels easier. And I mean, frogs aside, when I think of frogs, I just think of the frog book from like autism diagnosis. I don't know if anyone's had to read the frog book. They'll know what I mean if they did have to read the frog book. Anyway, yeah, so doing the hardest thing first often doesn't work for me because then I'm just feeling so anxious about doing the hardest thing. So even just doing like a small thing first or just tackling like one email, and then that usually gets me on like a train of, okay, I'm going to do all my emails now as well. And then the other thing that doesn't work for me is that take regular breaks or work in short bursts. Like, I need to get into a flow state. And if I work in short bursts, then that means I have to like start work multiple times. I don't want to do the hardest bit multiple times. I just want to work for a long period. And honestly, sometimes when I'm tossing up between, oh, should I get up early in the morning and do this? Or should I just like work through and then go to bed a bit later? I will always choose to work through. Like, I'd rather stay in the flow state and get things done now than break it up and try and work on it in the morning again.
Well, we're going to disagree with your advice right now because we're going to take a break. But I think in general, it's a good way to operate. So we'll be back shortly.
Hi there, Focus and Chillers. Are you ready to supercharge your knowledge in the realms of creativity, tech, and psychology? Come check out my fortnightly newsletter. In each edition, you'll get quick wins and actionable takeaways that you can put into practice right away. If this sounds like you, I'd love to have you as a reader. Subscribe for your fortnightly dose of insights. The link is in the show notes. And now, let's get back to the show.
All right, we're back from our break, which was unnecessary because we can just power through. And we're keen to hear about your morning routine. What is like and how has it evolved over time?
Yeah, I think it's really different for me this year. And I really wanted to stay honest when I was going to tell you about this, because previously I have had a really in detailed morning routine and a really strict morning routine as well. But it's really changed for me this year. And that's due to just changes in medication and changes in life as well. And I'm not necessarily happy about it, but I'm trying to stay honest and trying to be grateful for what I am able to still instill. I like to be first out of bed. That hasn't changed. I like to enjoy breakfast and coffee by myself, and generally whilst listening to an audiobook or a podcast. I find that really helps wake me up in the morning. And I like to start work before business hours would be the best way to describe it. I want at least that hour or hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours before anyone starts sending emails. I find emails really interrupt me throughout the day. So I like to have that solid working time where no one's bothering me as well. And Yeah, I think that's the main things for me at the moment is just being first up and at least having that 1 hour of time before people start emailing and calling.
And so you're mentioning that your morning routine has changed a bit, Rosie. Can you tell us a bit about your evening routine? How do you switch up at night?
Yeah, so my evening routine has changed, but I think it's changed for the better. I think my evening routine has become more optimized and my morning routine has got a bit less optimized. So I'd like to get into a place where they're both good, but I love my evening routine at the moment. I have a pretty strict sleep routine, and that's due to a history of insomnia. I think anyone who's experienced insomnia before knows that fear when you're not sleeping well and you're just like, oh no, is my insomnia going to get bad again? Am I not going to be able to sleep? I'm pretty strict with my sleep routine around that now. I've instilled something this year, which I call my mandatory low sensory hours. And that's generally from about 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. So I like to have that minimum 2 hours of time that is low sensory hours, generally spent in bed, just with the lamp on. We're not having the big light on, comfortable in pajamas, having the best time. And that's really important for me to have to wind down to be able to go to sleep. I don't really enjoy nighttime events for that reason. I only allow myself to break those low sensory hours like once a week for events. If I'm breaking that sort of more than once a week, that's when I can start getting just really overwhelmed. I'm going to be more prone to meltdowns. So I much prefer daytime events during my work hours. My night times are like really sacred to me. We go for a walk after work to debrief after work. We have dinner and shower pretty early. We watch like a couple of episodes of a TV show, and then I have my low sensory hours and time, and that needs to be by myself as well. Oh, the only other thing I wanted to say is that I use a Manta sleep mask. Not sponsored, but I really like this sleep mask. It has Bluetooth headphones in it, and so sometimes I listen to an audiobook or sometimes I just listen to sleep music or a meditation. That's probably been one of the biggest game changers and absolutely a piece of assistive technology for me. I really can't sleep without this sleep mask. I really do love it.
I love that language around the low sensory hours because I find the same, that I need to not have too much happening, and going to events in the evening, it's really not enjoyable for me and messes me up the next day. So I'm going to claim those hours, give it a name now. If people want to connect with you, where's the best place for them to find you online?
Yeah, so the best place is probably LinkedIn. I know that's not everyone's favorite. When I say that I'm a LinkedIn girly, I often get questions like, why are you on LinkedIn? I really love it. I feel really safe there, and I share pretty regularly there. Rosie Putland on LinkedIn, my main social media of choice. I am trying to branch out, but I think LinkedIn will always be my home base. In terms of my business, if you're interested in digital accessibility, you want to chat, you just think your organization could benefit from training or consulting, or you're looking for a little bit of coaching yourself, definitely reach out to us. And that's at www.modalityco.com. And then the last thing is the Tasmanian Digital Accessibility Community. I know it says Tasmanian at the start, but we have an online. We always have an online meeting as well. So you can 100% join if you're not from Tasmania. That's totally fine. We have a lot of interstate people join with us, and you can find us on meetup.com.
Well, Rosie, it's been wonderful having you on. Do you have any final words or ask for our audience?
Yeah, I guess final words is just meet people where they're at in their journey, whether it be their neurodivergence journey or a disability journey or an accessibility journey. Sometimes it can be really easy to judge, or you might be further along in your journey, but try to meet people where they're at. I think it's really important as we go through as well, and you meet more neurodivergent people or more disabled people as well. And then the other part of that, which kind of like partners with that, is that community is probably the most powerful tool you can have. We didn't get a lot into it in this chat, but for me, community has been like one of the most important parts of my journey and my development to who I am today. So I think we went from like right at the start to like where I am now. And that whole middle process was really about connecting with my community. So I just really wanted to highlight that as it's really important.
Wonderful. And we'll wrap the show with that.
Thanks, Joey. Thanks, Jeremy.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Focus and Chill podcast. To listen to other episodes, jump onto podcast.focusbear.io. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, or you know someone who'd be a good fit, email us at team@focusbear.io. Otherwise, stay focused, stay chilled, and peace out.